With all that being said, it is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers today, all current Rotary Peace Fellows at the University of Bradford. So beginning with Juliet Adoch, who is from Uganda and is undertaking a Master's in International Relations and Security Studies. She has a long history working with community-based organizations in conflict and post-conflict settings, and has a strong interest in refugee issues, transitional justice, and governance. Shannon Carter is from the United States and is undertaking a Master's of Project Planning. Shannon spent 31 months in Ukraine in an extended service for the US Peace Corps, working with youth through school development programs and deep involvement with Raleigh, Ukraine. Chris Piper, also from the United States, is undertaking an MA in Peace, Conflict and Development. Chris has a background in law, serving as an attorney, specializing in government and international law. He also has a background and deep interest in civil society and interfaith dialogue, having spent many years as a community leader within those fields. Maria Cristina Cifuentes from Colombia is undertaking an MA International Relations and Security Studies. Christina has a varied background, having worked across government, policy, youth, and environment, to name just a few. Christina is interested in positive peace, peace building, and conflict resolution. Ji Young Moon from South Korea is undertaking a Master's in Peace, Conflict, and Development. Ji has a background working in community development settings in Rwanda and Vietnam, which solidified her interest in peace building, refugee protection, humanitarian response, and emergency relief. Peter Mashiang Gadwell is undertaking an MA in International Relations and Security Studies. Peter's professional background is in peacekeeping and peacebuilding in South Sudan, most recently with the United Nations mission in South Sudan in civilian protection, conflict mitigation, and the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations Gender Parity Policy, integrating women, peace and security agenda with the protection of civilians mandate. And for myself, I'm from Australia and undertaking an MA International Relations and Security Studies. I've worked with nonprofits in the space of youth, climate and international development, and in digital campaigning for social change with a focus on strategic communications. So today we'll be looking at the topics of sexual violence and trafficking in conflict and non-conflict settings. These topics are insidious, both in their exploitation of vulnerable people and in how little they're spoken about in proportion to how widespread and ingrained they are. The purpose of today's session is to do just that, to spend time speaking about difficult issues that exist oftentimes in contexts we wouldn't expect to hear about them. It can be uncomfortable and confronting, but it's important to speak about them and to continue to raise awareness. We'll look first at the topic of sexual violence in conflict, focusing on the International Day to End Sexual Violence in Conflict, and consider some case studies from conflict settings of South Sudan and Colombia. We'll then explore the topic of human trafficking and examine 2 case studies from the non-conflict settings of the United States and North Korea. We'll then move to a reflection and discussion pertaining to the issues covered, and come together again as a group for a final reflection and to close out the session. It is now my pleasure to hand over to Juliet Adoch to outline the topic of sexual violence in conflict. Thank you, Juliet.
Thank you very much, Eva, and welcome everyone to this session. I would like by first starting off to recognize today as the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict that is being commemorated globally. And this is the 7th commemoration, having been adopted in 2015 June, the same date, and also reflecting on the theme that has attracted our theme, or our theme being drawn from. This year's global theme is Building Back Better, supporting survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in the context of the pandemic recovery. We're all aware what the pandemic has done, so reflecting the theme for conflict-related survivors of sexual violence is quite important. I will reflect on key issues in relation to the term conflict-related sexual violence. In often cases, this is mixed with sexual violence generally, but this has become it's almost now 15 years where the phenomenon of conflict-related sexual violence has started picking up, though with the recognition of a specific day coming up 7 years ago. So key terms around conflict-related sexual violence highlight the different forms of sexual violence that have existed. Some of them, to mention a few, we have rape, we have sexual slavery, we have forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, and forced sterilization, forced marriage, among other forms of violence. And this is only referred to as conflict-related sexual violence if it's directly or indirectly related to a conflict setting. But what has also come up a lot is the aspect of trafficking of persons in conflict also being related to sexual violence, because we know that in the context of trafficking, a lot of things happen around sexual violence and exploitation. And to move forward, I picked on 3 resolutions that I felt were key in us commemorating this day and bringing light to the discussion around conflict-related sexual violence. One of them is Resolution 1820, which was key in pointing out sexual violence in conflict as a weapon of war. Not to say that sexual violence is something new, it's been happening over the years, but having a resolution in place that critically brings a reflection on it as a weapon of war is quite important. The other resolution is 1960 that points to or brings about accountability architecture to the whole aspect of conflict-related sexual violence, but also puts in place measures to monitor and bring out the different trends of conflict-related sexual violence. And also it goes on to expand the mandate of sexual violence as a tactic of war. And thirdly is the Resolution 2106, which we know that in most conflict settings, women and girls are most affected when it comes to sexual violence. But predominantly we are seeing that men and boys also are equally affected. And though with, especially in the global south and the conflict, the whole aspect around male survivors of sexual violence is not something that is very key or predominant. So with a resolution that notifies and also brings to book or brings to the light that boys and men are equally affected with sexual violence is permanent. That's why these 3 resolutions become important. Now, to mention a few impacts that we felt were important when it came to conflict-related sexual violence and its impact on the day-to-day survivors of conflict. Key one is the widespread aspect that sexual violence hampers post-conflict recovery. We know when you're a victim of sexual violence, there's a lot that you have to deal with, both personally, but also in terms of your own relation to society. So the whole aspect of having to rebuild your life in post-conflict is difficult, especially when the right support networks are not there for survivors. 2 is it undermines the social stability. Sexual violence destroys families, and this in relation to the traumatic experiences that victims go through. We know that victims of conflict, especially those who have experienced sexual violence, that is normally associated with shame, is associated with a lot of health needs that come with it, but also breakages of marriage, because not everyone will be accepting of a partner that has been sexually violated. So this brings a lot destroying of families, but also social fabrics in society. The other issue around here is the physical health need that comes with survivors of sexual violence. In conflict settings, normally health needs are to address immediate health needs, but there's no specialized services that look at survivors of sexual violence, especially where surgery is needed for survivors, where aspect of specialized medication is needed for survivors. You find that survivors then go on to live with their physical and health needs for a long period of time. And also another issue that comes in that is being talked about a lot is the children born of war, who struggle with issues of identity in post-conflict and also in conflict situations, because these are children whose paternity is unknown. And speaking from the global south, mainly Africa, where the paternal lineage is very important in aspects of inheritance rights and also identity of a person. When one's paternity is not known as a result of rape and the father not known, it brings on a lot for a child in a society, but also how that child is accepted and integrated into society. So these are some of the key issues it brings around helping a community stabilize. The other aspect when it comes to survivors in context of conflict is affecting their mobility. Survivors of sexual violence often live in fear of reoccurrence, but also those around them, when they know this is being used as a tactic of war, are afraid to be able to move into places and go on with their daily lives. And economic activities require one to move from one place to the other. And also this is an aspect that trafficking comes in, where there's a fear around it itself. So you find that people are confined and afraid to go on with their day-to-day lives because of the fear that surrounds this, and this limits them economically developing. And lastly is the issue around accountability for victims, which is lacking. And also you find that governments do not bring to book perpetrators of violence, of conflict, especially sexual violence. And this has made a number of people, especially survivors, lose trust and faith in the rule of law in the specific countries and also globally. Lastly, I'll highlight that while conflict-related sexual violence is key, we should know that it is linked to trafficking in a number of ways, and all happen in the conflict or the context of conflict and non-conflict settings. But in relation to conflict-related sexual violence, I would like to point out that based on the General Secretary's report of 2021, which reflects January to December 2020, he highlights a number of issues, but I picked out a few to reflect here. Is the amplified gender-based inequality that this has created, not only in conflict settings, but also in non-conflict settings, and not only with sexual with conflict-related sexual violence, but as well as trafficking, where we have seen an increase in the inequalities that have happened during the pandemic. Two is the limited response, especially in structural, institutional, and social cultural barriers to reporting. Already there has been a huge gap in reporting of sexual violence and trafficking as a whole, but the pandemic has made it worse, with a lot of concentration going to prevention of getting of getting COVID-19, of response to COVID-19, and a number of people continue to suffer in silence in this pandemic. And also with the institutions that should have been responding to the needs of survivors, focusing most on what on the current trends, which is the pandemic. Lastly, lastly is the complexities around the justice issues and redress. Already earlier mentioned that there's already a gap in justice for victims. So with the pandemic, we noticed that this gap is widened. With limited sittings due to fear of the pandemic, due to fear of COVID, but also redress not coming for victims. So you realize that victims suffer in depth, and this will be highlighted further in the aspect of human trafficking by my colleagues. And lastly is the issue around the humanitarian structure's limited reach. A number of people have not been able to get a response in humanitarian setting, and this also continues to create a gap. And right now we're not seeing the pandemic reducing either. So we know that in the coming years, there will be more issues around conflict-related sexual violence, trafficking, and also in non-conflict and conflict settings. My colleagues will then highlight case studies of specific countries in relation to conflict-related sexual violence and trafficking, but also to note that later my colleagues will speak specifically to human trafficking and sexual violence in non-conflict settings. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Juliet. And now what we'll do is to dive a little bit deeper into the issue of sexual violence in conflict by looking at a case study on South Sudan. So I'd like to invite my colleague, Peter Mashiang-Gadwell, to present this section.
Thank you, Iba. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session. And I will be straight to the case study of South Sudan, and I will link it to the overview provided by my colleague, Juliet Adoch. So South Sudan, represent one of the worst, hit country in terms of, crisis. And as a result, the trend in conflict-related sexual violence, against women and girls is on the rise. So this presentation will provide an highlight, of trends, of conflict-related sexual violence between 2013 and 2020. And we'll also discuss some of the policy gaps that exist in accountability, against conflict-related sexual violence. Due to the outbreak of war in South Sudan, so the rule of law institution were heavily impacted, and as a result, the conflict-related sexual violence, increased. And according to the United Nations General Secretary reports of 2018, so 95% of the victims are basically women and girls. Since 2014, the common perpetrators in the conflict-related sexual violence have been combatants, in the various factions of the South Sudan armed conflict. The beast by the United Nations Special Envoy, Danaif Bangura, described the crime of sexual violence, in 2016 as so bad, and has urged, the leaders in South Sudan to make it an effort in terms of, of reconciliation and healing. Looking at the trends of conflict-related sexual violence between 2014 and 2020, you will see that there was, an increase in the beginning up to the end. So the number actually, tripled between 2014 and 2016. And this is due to the, the collapse in the first peace deal that was signed in 2015 in Addis Ababa. So later in the second half of the conflict between 2016 and 2020, so the number of cases were on decline. So this data is obtained from the United Nations General Secretary report, the various reports from 2014 to 2020. So in terms of hotspots, the number of of impacted locations are basically at the borders where that were heavily contested by the the various factions of the of South Sudan conflict. So most affected region is Unity State in the mid-north, so as well as Upper Nile, northeast, and at the southern part of the map, you can see that central Equatoria, which is basically located in the, which is around the capital, is also one of the heavily hit, in terms of conflict-related sexual violence incident, in addition to Western Equatoria, as well as, Western Baragadal. So these regions became, impacted by the conflict-related sexual violence during the second half of the conflict, because several rebel groups, did not join the first peace deal, and as well there were, all-out groups that start, to desert the government troop and start fighting the government. Next, in terms of policy tools, South Sudan Transitional Constitution 2011 is one of the main policy tools that regulate the issue related to sexual related violence and give the woman the affirmative action of 25% through representation. So South Sudan also has a national action plan which covers 2015 to 2020. So this national action plan addresses issues related to women peace security agenda, and the focus is mainly through the post-conflict period, through prevention, protection, participation of women. However, the plan do not, adequately address the justice for victims of conflict-related sexual violence. In addition to those tools, the peace agreement that was signed recently, which is the revitalized agreement on the resolution of conflict in South Sudan, signed in 2018, is one of the, policy frameworks, that puts the agenda of conflict-related sexual violence into, into the attention. So basically, the conflict, the peace agreement has provided some important institutions, such as the hybrid court, and proposed, prosecution of war crimes, as well as establishment of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In addition to the domestic tools, South Sudan has also a gap in terms of international policy, subscribing to international policy instruments. So, for example, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against, women, which was adopted in 1979, and its additional protocol of 1999 has not yet been ratified by the government of South Sudan. So The other instruments which are also very important are the International Convention on Civic and Political Rights of 1996. So the African Union Charter on Human Rights as well, the Convention Against Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment of or punishment, so has not yet been, ratified by the government of South Sudan. So consequently, there is, a huge gap in terms of prosecuting victims of war crimes related to conflict-related sexual violence. In terms of policy actions, there is need to do more, fact-finding through research, especially on the situation of female victimhood in South Sudan, to inform further dimension of the conflict, because South Sudan conflict is one of the worst conflict in terms of human rights violation, and it has been on the top of international discussions, especially at the Security Council. So on the other hand, there is need to put international pressure to the various parties to the agreement in order to make sure that peace agreement is implemented, and perpetrators are accounted, especially on the abuses of human rights that were committed during the conflict. In addition, there is need for support of security and justice sector in South Sudan, as well as recovery of small arms from non-state actors, such as community militias, and that particularly engage in the violation of of human rights in South Sudan, and in reference to conflict-related sexual violence. So this is the brief overview of what is happening in South Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that snapshot into conflict-related sexual violence in South Sudan. And I'd now like to welcome Maria Cristina Cifuentes to speak on the situation in Colombia.
Thank you very much, Eva, for the introduction, and also thanks everybody for joining us. The third most lucrative trade in the world has strongly affected my home country, Colombia, and we will now review the following case study, its causes, consequences, and possible solutions. Between 2013 and 2019, the number of human trafficking in Colombia has considerably increased, and people between 18 and 30 years old have been the most affected age group in the country, mainly because they face difficulties in finding equal employment opportunities, and also they are facing risks associated with gender discrimination. Furthermore, according to the Observatory on the Crime of Human Trafficking, 82% of the victims are women. And actually, it's important to know that there are cases of service marriage where sexual labor exploitation predominates. As we can see in the chart, according to the annual report of human trafficking done by UNODC, in 2018, most of the victims are children, and in Colombia, the amount of girls among the total of victims of trafficking represented 10%. In 2018, when the GDP per capita, as we can see, was 15,643, which let us analyze that the effect of increasing GDP per capita in every country is inversely proportional with the amount of victims of human trafficking. Additionally, the Embassy of the United States in Colombia highlighted that the government response capacity has improved in terms of crime identification, and they appreciate the efforts of the Colombian state to strengthen the regulatory and institutional framework, as well as all the efforts that denaturalize the gender violence through violence prevention activities. The Colombian armed conflict was for a long time one of the world's longest running active civil war. As a consequence of the conflict, the level of poverty, displacement, and lack of opportunities increased, and people started looking for alternatives for sustainability of their families. Unfortunately, a common alternative in some cities of my country, such as Medellin or Cali, has been the involvement of human trafficking activities. This is a prison from which it is very difficult to escape, but from which is also a very attractive activity for victims by obtaining high amounts of money that they require for the sustainability of their families. And another cause is the lack of children protection, especially with the new mechanism of actions and also the modus operandi of the crime groups, because there are technological tools, especially using social networks, that sadly facilitates child and women abduction. Of the Colombian regulatory framework is highlighted that there is an article in the National Constitution, the Article 17, that promotes the protection for victims of human trafficking. And also we have the Law 985 of 2005, which purpose is to adopt measures to guarantee respect for the human rights of the potential victims of human trafficking. As well, as the Decree 1069 of 2014, which purpose is to regulate the competences to carry out by the entities that are responsible for the adoption of protection and assistance measures for the victims. And it also promotes the immediate assistance program to guarantee the return of the victims to the country. And also, once they arrive to the country, they promote an assistance in security, dignified accommodation, medical, psychological, and material assistance, and also legal advice regarding the rights and legal procedures. Nevertheless, it has been criticized a lot because the assistance should be not only immediate, but also long-term assistance, bearing in mind that the victims deserve and expect quality care to rebuild their lives and an integral socio-psychological help to heal such a big and deep bonds. It is also important to mention that our penal code prescribes the punishment and penalties for this crime. We have very interesting initiatives in the country that are developed currently, as the one named Blue Heart Campaign, Campaña Corazón Azul. It's a global awareness raising initiative to fight human trafficking and its impact on society. In the case of my country, there is an important cooperation between ICBF, or the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, and they work together in order to restore the rights of children and adolescents who are direct victims of human trafficking. The project also about combating human trafficking in Colombia, the national one, is aimed at strengthening the capacity of national and local authorities that have to implement actions to develop in public policy against human trafficking contained in the law 985 of 2005. The modus operandi of the traffickers is varied. Victims are primarily exploited in groups by organized actors, and according to some testimonies from different NGOs, many clients who come from different countries negotiate before going to Colombia to have a night, especially with children that are virgin. And there are testimonies about families who have been threatened since their children are 5 or 6 years old. And those threats are for child abduction. Unfortunately, there are families who sell their children on purpose for getting a high amount of money. And the main victims are reported from areas of poverty in cities where there is a high level of crime. The crime groups ask some women to normally who are always on the street and find them clients for one night and give them the biggest percentage of the payment. And there is another very common strategy that they use, and it's through fake model agencies. And it's a kind of trick to be part of a modeling agency in other country. And they take many Colombian women to be part of the trafficking network and take away their papers, their legal papers. So there is any possibility to come back or to escape. And about the feasible solutions, we highlight the following. We can provide immediate assistance and financial support because for the National Development Program in local level, there is not enough budget to invest in this kind of strategies to combat this crime. That's the reason why the government must work on searching the cooperation, international cooperation or local cooperation with some other institutions for working on applying those strategies. It's also a very important strategy to develop productive projects for short and long-term reintegration. In that way, we can combat the poverty, and then families don't have to search an alternative like this one. And it is very necessary. It is very necessary to work on prevention programs, especially in schools, because we really need to go to the ground and explain to the children which are the red flags to prevent and not to be victims of this awful crime. And in that way, through those social economic development strategies, we can promote security and positive peace approach, because it is not only important to identify the organized crime groups, but also to work in an integral support for the victims and for population in general, for preventing to be victims of this crime. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that presentation, Christina, and also thank you to Peter and Juliet for your contributions to that section. Christina introduced the topic of sexual violence in human trafficking, and I'd now like to invite Christopher Piper to give a legal overview of human trafficking, and Shannon Carter to give an overview of the broader issue, and then move into our first case study in a non-conflict setting for the United States.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'd like to step back for a moment and look at the concepts that we've been addressing here, which are sexual violence and human trafficking. And I think it's worth briefly examining how they interrelate. I think it's helpful to view them as overlapping circles of a Venn diagram, as illustrated here, in the sense that there are lots of forms of sexual violence, both within conflicts, conflict-related, as we've discussed today, as well as non-conflict related. And some of those may overlap with human trafficking, may be in fact human trafficking. And I think, as we'll address a little bit further when we get into the definition of human trafficking, that not all trafficking is comprised of sexual violence. The other really important distinction, which I'll be addressing today, is legal. Sexual violence and its many manifestations are governed by a disparate but fairly comprehensive set of long-standing criminal laws. Human trafficking, on the other hand, is actually a new crime. Now, that's not to say that the phenomenon is new. Human trafficking is as old as time. And it's also not to say that there haven't been laws that have addressed it. Many criminal laws have long addressed practices associated with it, but the concept as a whole, human trafficking, has only recently emerged as a prosecutable crime. And this has been a direct result of international regimes and trends within the last really couple of decades is all. And defining it as a crime, human trafficking itself, does a few things. It galvanizes public opinion and allows the public to kind of come around it and support efforts to decrease human trafficking. It also securitizes the issue, and then it makes it enforceable. It creates a deterrent, and once there's an enforceable means of punishment, then it creates a deterrent to trafficking itself. And so now I'll go ahead and address the international legal sources that govern human trafficking that have had such a significant impact on this field. Specifically, the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime is the primary authority. That has 3 protocols within it, one of which most directly addresses human trafficking, and that's the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. And the whole effort is led and coordinated by the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons, also referred to as UN GIFT, Global Initiative to Fight Human Trafficking. And these developed only within the last 20 years, as I mentioned. The convention came about in the year 2000. And leading and coordinating is the right way to describe and characterize what the UN has done. One of the most important ways that it has led in bringing efforts and focus to this issue is by defining human trafficking. And this in many ways is a challenge but had required the international community to provide enough specificity to allow enforcement and punishment, give it real teeth, while at the same time making sure it captures as many manifestations of trafficking as possible. So human trafficking is defined as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people through force, fraud, or deception, with the aim of exploiting them for profit. And I would bring to your attention that there are 3 elements here. There must be an action taken by the perpetrator. There must be coercive means or some degree of force. And there must be a purpose for exploitation. Now, the range of each one of these elements is quite broad, but all 3 of them must be met. And I would emphasize that if you examine this a little bit closer, it's not just the movement of women and girls for sexual exploitation, which is the traditional understanding of what human trafficking is. It could involve a range of actors, a range of victims. It does not actually require movement. In fact, there's nothing that even crossing an international border is not an essential element of human trafficking. And I would go on. I would emphasize that the definition has had enormous influence. Local jurisdictions throughout the world have passed laws based on the UN definition. And it's really this local level of enforcement and prosecution that has really had the greatest impact and has the greatest potential for substantial impact. The norms at the international and structural level are important and have been critical here, but it's really the actual implementation on the ground that matters the most. That is where the vulnerable can really be effectively protected. And it makes sense that it's local. Perpetrators are often involved in other crimes, such as distribution of illegal drugs. Often violence or abuse are present, and many other crimes that are traditionally and best enforced and prosecuted at the local level. So one of the keys here is to train law enforcement and prosecutors to be able to spot the elements of human trafficking and charge with this additional crime. And again, many local jurisdictions, including my own home state of Utah, have passed laws creating a crime of human trafficking. And so once there's training and education involved, then that can become an element. And targeting the practice itself effectively creates deterrence. And this also speaks to why community involvement has an impact. Spotting the signs and other day-to-day trafficking activities really happen at the community level, and my colleague Shannon Carter will go into that a little bit further. So I hope this gives a sense for the legal issues at play, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Chris. That was very informative. The information about the cover will echo off what Maria and Chris just stated. As we have reviewed 2 studies in conflict settings, and now we'll explore examples in non-conflict settings on the subjects of sexual violence and provide a brief synopsis on recent statistics on how large this problem is across the globe. Human trafficking is hidden in plain sight. But are you able to spot it? What industries does it encompass? How much illegal revenue does it produce? And what can we do? It can happen to anyone. And available evidence suggests that people of color and LGBTQ people are more likely to be trafficked than other demographic groups. Generational trauma, historical oppression, discrimination, and other societal factors and inequalities create community-wide vulnerabilities. Men, women, children of all ages, from all backgrounds, can be victims of this crime, which occurs in every region of the world. But if we cannot see them, where are they? And as I asked earlier, which industries are they in? Is it so obvious? So I have a question for you. This is going to be a little activity amongst all of us, and please respond in the chat box. We have to be very brief, like 30 seconds, but can you give me an idea of what you believe, which industries come to mind when you think about human trafficking? So please provide your answer in the chat box, and we will look at that. All right, I got nail bars, domestic workers, hotel, motel. All right, a couple more, please. All right, that's modeling, yes, as we stated, brick industry. All right, we got construction, we have hospitality. Okay, fantastic, fantastic. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and move forward. Now, according to the Polaris Project, a nonprofit private organization that works to combat and prevent modern day slavery and human trafficking, there are at least 25 different industries, and this is identified by the US in the United States, where trafficking is prevalent. You can find more information at polarisproject.org. Now, some of these industries include restaurant and food service. And we're talking about how traffickers often take advantage of language barriers between exploited workers. Another one is healthcare, nursing home workers, people who have visas, and they come here legally, and unfortunately they get trapped here. Domestic workers. Survivors are predominantly middle-aged women to older-aged women who get entrapped. Bars, strip clubs. Our frequent victims are, they're even US citizens and Eastern European girls and Hispanic women as well. Agriculture, animal husbandry. Victims typically work in tobacco, cattle, dairy, orange, tomato, and strawberry farms. And we can't also forget about recreational facilities, seasonal work as well, like lifeguards, camp counselors, ride attendants, food vendors, when it comes to this problem that is. So we have this wide scope. It's pretty much in almost every industry across the globe. So which takes us to our second question. How much money does the global forced labor generate annually? Well, how much do you think it does? So please provide your answer in the chat box and I'll give you 30 seconds. Just give me some guesses, please. Okay, 1 billion, a trillion. A couple more, please. Give me just your random idea of how much do you think the forced labor generates globally. 10 billion, okay. Many billions, alrighty. Let's talk about it. $150 billion in illegal profits per year. Data provided, and this data is provided by the International Labor Organization, which there's a link for them as well. You can go to International Labor Organization to find that statistic. And now 2/3 of the profits are from commercial sexual exploitation. The rest is from forced economic, domestic work, agriculture, child, and related activities. Okay, so let's look at the wider scope of this. How many people are actually involved in this process? So there's an estimated 40.3 million people are in modern day human trafficking. And this includes about 24.9 million in forced labor and 15.4 million in forced marriages. Now, forced marriage is not yet widely recognized as human trafficking, depending on the institution or organization that defines whether or not they believe forced marriage is part of human trafficking. It's subjective at this point. Now, 4.5 victims for every 1,000 people in the world, unfortunately, have been involved in human trafficking at some point. 1 in 4 of those victims are children. Now, out of the 24.9 million people trapped in forced labor, 16 million of people are exploited in private sectors such as domestic work, construction, and agriculture, as we mentioned. And then the 4.8 million persons are forced in sexual acts. And then 4 million persons in forced labor imposed by state authorities. Now, women and girls are disproportionately affected by forced labor, accounting for about 99% of the victims in commercial sex industry and 58% in other sectors. The share of children among detected trafficking victims has tripled, while the share of boys has increased 5 times in the past 15 years. There's a correlation of children, unfortunately, being targeted more and more as years pass on. All right. Now, we're talking about human trafficking, but how do we spot it? How do we see it? And it's around us, unfortunately. But we have to be able to be a little bit more mindful of our space and see what we can do to help eradicate the stigma of it, of people trapped in this industry. Now, according to the US Department of State, the individual can appear as malnourished, so signs of physical injuries or abuse. They avoid eye contact, actually, and they can be scared of authority figures or law enforcement. It's like a grooming process by the perpetrator to the victim, is that they condition them to believe a certain kind of thought process. So they're over a period of time, they become fearful of like what they're doing wrong, or if the victim is going to get persecuted for their act because they know they're doing something illegal, but they've been groomed into the process of doing it. So, and they also seemingly adhere to scripted or rehearsed responses and social interaction, like I just said. Lacking identification documents is another example. And they can appear destitute or lacking personal possessions. They don't have anything. They work excessively long hours, not by choice, or they think they need to or they have to as the victim of the situation. And another red flag is living at the place of employment. So now traffickers often use violence or fraudulent employment agencies, such as Christina mentioned earlier about modeling agencies, and fake promises of education and job opportunities to coerce their victims. They have a dialogue, they have a story, they have an enticing agenda, basically, where they bring people in promising something and then they entrap them. So, okay. So now that we talked about spotting trafficking, there's a lot more information out there too for you to dive into to educate yourself on the ideas about the facts or the red flags of what you can find or see when you notice someone is being human trafficked. Now, okay, so like I mentioned earlier, it can happen to anyone, and anyone can be trafficked. So what can we do? The most important thing is to report it. Is that we need more statistical information, and we need to be able to have the education and resources to make the right decisions given the circumstances. So there's this wonderful online interactive public searchable database of over 2,900 organizations and hotlines working on human trafficking and forced labor around the world. So if you go to globalmodernslavery.org, there is this huge resource database of, and depending on the country you're in, the resources for you to connect with those organizations to see what kind of impact we can have when it comes to reporting human trafficking. Okay, now, as an American, I'm going to give an example of an American institution. There's over almost 3,000 of them. I would love to go through all of them. Unfortunately, for this time's sake, I can't. But as one example of one of the almost 3,000 organizations is the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline, called the Polaris Project, as I mentioned earlier. Now, since 2007, this organization has operated the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline. It provides 24-hour support, a variety of options for survivors and human trafficking to get connected, to help and stay safe. Now, they have nearly a network of 4,000 partner services throughout the United States, and they have trained hotline advocates that can help you if you spot and provide you tips of what's really happening in the dialogue of the situation that you've witnessed in human trafficking. So, and so community members, and they help survivors build plans so they can leave safe, like they basically can safely leave their situations or get help that they need to rebuild their lives, right? Because they've been entrapped. And now what can we do to help them move out? And they need these resources. So the National Hotline can communicate in over 200 languages. And they have a variety of services they can provide, such as text, web chat, email, web form in English and Spanish. So please feel free to look into those, that information through those two sources I provided to dive into that a little bit more. Okay. All right, and as my last slide to conclude my section of this event is that we're going to dive a little deeper into the United States statistics. Okay, so it is estimated that between 15 to 50,000 women, men, and children are forced into human trafficking in the United States every year. And that total number actually varies very widely, unfortunately, as it's difficult to research due to the nature of human trafficking, the criminal nature, the secrecy, and the victims in the lack of the victims coming forward to express their experience due to the stigma of human trafficking. So, and it's actually shown that as the disparities are pretty large in those numbers, they're even larger than that statistic. One study from the Department of Health and Human Services in 2016 estimated that the number is actually between 240 to 325,000 people. And then while a report from the University of Pennsylvania put it between 100,000 to 300,000. So there's huge disparity in these numbers, as they're not, we haven't been able to actually grasp the impact or encompass the entire problem into a bubble. And I hope as we move forward, as more people come forward with their experiences of human trafficking, that we're going to be able to pinpoint that more down and help people on a larger scale. So thank you, Eva. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for your introduction, Chris. And this concludes my section of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for that insightful look at human trafficking and especially its presence in the United States. Now I'd like to invite Jeong Moon, who will talk about human trafficking issues in North Korea.
Thanks, Eva. I'll be presenting human trafficking issues in North Korea. Before going into the issue, this is the escape route of North Koreans. And as you can see, going through China is the only way to escape the country. So I'll be looking in both North Korea and its border area with China in my presentation. North Korea remains the most repressive country in the world, where no free movement and communication with the outside world is not allowed. And it considers defection as treachery against the nation, and anyone repatriated from China faces severe and arbitrary punishment. A United Nations report of 2014 concluded that systematic, widespread, and gross human rights violation committed by the North Korean government constituted crimes against humanity. These included forced abortion, rape, and other sexual violence, as well as murder, imprisonment, enslavement, and torture of North Koreans in prison or detention. Sexual violence in North Korea is an open, unaddressed, and widely tolerated secret, and the contributing factors are deeply embedded patterns of gender inequality, a lack of awareness about sexual violence, corruption and lack of the rule of law, social stigma, and a lack of social support and legal services. Now, who are the at-risk group? The North Korean defectors in China suffered widespread abuses, in addition to the abuses suffered by the general population. Human traffickers and brokers, often linked to government actors, subject women to sexual exploitation and sexual slavery in China, including through forced marriage. Defectors should be protected under the international law as refugees. However, they forcibly repatriated from China to North Korea and faced severe punishment, including execution, imprisonment, torture, and sexual violence without due process or a fair trial. Now, let's look at the actions taken by the key international actors to address the issue. First of all, South Korean government enacted the North Korean Human Rights Act in 2016, which specifically requires the government to implement the UN's recommendation to research and publish status reports on human rights in North Korea. However, it has not created an investigation foundation, which was mandated by the law. And China is the most influential international actor in North Korea and has strong political and economic ties. But the Chinese government is not cooperating with the key actors to address the issues. The US continues to impose the human rights related sanctions on North Korea. And during the two-times summit in 2019, the Trump administration only discussed the weapons proliferation issues. Lastly, the United Nations adopted resolutions condemning the human rights violation in North Korea and continues to recall preventing further violation and strengthening protection. As you can see, key actors in the region and international community face difficulties cooperating with both the North Korean government and Chinese government to investigate in open and transparent manners, as the issues are politically sensitive. And thank you for your attention. I'll wrap up my presentation here. And if anyone interested in looking into this issue in more depth, please see the chat box later for Eva's email address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, G, for that interesting look into human trafficking in North Korea. And thank you so much to Shannon and Chris for your contributions as well. It is indeed difficult to cover the depth and complexity of these issues in such different contexts in such a short amount of time. But this has been a useful sort of snapshot and a look into each area, especially considering that the US and North Korea are not necessarily the first places we think of when discussing sexual violence and human trafficking. As G mentioned, we do have a list of resources that I'm happy to send out to anyone who is interested in reading more about the topics that we have presented today. So I'll put my email address in the chat box, and anyone who would like a copy of that, just send me an email. So conscious that we have been talking at you for about an hour now, so now we're going to split into some breakout rooms for a little bit of discussion. So I will post our discussion question in the chat box, but you can also see it on the screen in front of you. And so what we'll be doing in these discussion rooms is having a bit of reflection on the topics of sexual violence and trafficking. One group will look at the issues in conflict settings, and one group will explore the issues in non-conflict settings. And we'll have members from the presenting group in each session guiding the conversation. Afterwards, we will come back as a main group and have a bit more reflection and discussion on what we talked about in these different groups. So give me 2 seconds while I just set up all of the breakout rooms. And we'll be in the breakout rooms for about 15 minutes, just so you are aware. And breakout rooms are happening now.
Lovely presentation, G and Chris.
Yeah.
Thanks. Amazing job.
I think everyone did an amazing job. Hello, Kim. Hello, Melvin. Hello, Rashawn. And thank you for joining us.
Hey, everyone.
I think we should wait 1 more minute, shouldn't we? See if anybody else will join us before we go ahead and dive into this subject. I see Juan has joined us as well. Hello, Susan. Hello, Kay.
So can I ask a question? This is Kim from Washington, D.C. Shannon, I came in the middle of your presentation. It was excellent, and it's staggering the size, the scope of it in the United States. How do we get access to that information? Are you going to put your email in the chat box, or?
Actually, Eva, who is organizing this, she's going to have a complete reference list of all of the discussions that we've had on the topics broken down by individuals. So you'll have all the links of where I got that information provided by Eva.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, guys, so I think we should go ahead and dive into this because we've done some talking, but I'm really curious about your input. And your thoughts on this discussion topic. So given the discussions, presentations, and based on your interaction spaces of engagement and country experience, what are your reflections on sexual violence and human trafficking?
May I?
Yes, please.
Hello. So I'm Roshan and I'm from Mumbai. I've been a judge and I'm a lawyer and I'm a legal consultant. I come across these cases of trafficking. And when I heard so many people from so many countries, I felt that it's the same everywhere, as you had also said. In fact, I sometimes tell my students or my workshop people that even if we go to Antarctica, it's going to come to Antarctica also. It is so pandemic. And in India, we have three kind of, sections: the source, the transit, and the destination. And in India, we have all three. So the source may come from some other country like Bangladesh or Nepal into India. It may start from India and go into, say, Dubai or Europe. And it may also land up in some of our cities like Mumbai or Delhi. And this is not only in industries, mainly it is sexual violence. And I feel the main cause is the higher amount of population, the large family size. Children cannot be afforded. They are sold, they are abandoned, neglected, and they become vulnerable. If we go to that root cause, then alone can we attack this problem.
So this is Kim in Washington, D.C. area, and I'm a Rotary Peace Fellow. This sex and labor trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It is very lucrative, and this is one of the reasons it's so to catch, also because it's under the radar and because you have so many vulnerable people afraid to speak out. I know even in Washington, D.C., some embassies have been involved with at least labor trafficking, and young women have been hidden in the homes with no passport, no English ability, and they don't know how to get out. And so it is pervasive. It is absolutely pervasive. And most Americans don't realize it's happening right here in our own country. So I don't know what to do about the multi-billion-dollar industry. As long as there's so much money to be made, it's very hard to crack down on.
Kim, thank you for that. I recently was doing some research to figure out which city is the largest in the United States for the human trafficking, and I need to inform you that Washington, D.C. is #1 currently, involvement in human trafficking in the United States.
Yes, I wouldn't be surprised. And there are a number of organizations working on it locally here, but it's still, especially with embassies, you get ambassadors saying to people in their home country, I will take care of your daughter. She will come and work for me and I will give her a better life. And they come, the daughters are told, do what he says. And then it turns out to be labor or sex trafficking. And it's very hard to catch.
Melvin, did you have a comment?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I will talk about my previous capacity because I work with ILO, especially in Middle East, where I can relate to different topics you discussed. One of the major things like we found in our research previously, I don't know, it was like 5-6 years ago, about the corruption, systematic corruption in the police system, who are in charge of keeping these victims safe. But we found like a lot of police is corrupted. You haven't mentioned that in your presentations, but I think it's good to give some insight about the corrupted police systems. One of the things which I was briefly working on when I was in South Korea, which is the route from North Korea to China. We hope like we also force the Chinese government in order not to return refugees back to North Korea. The third point I want to discuss is I work in this topic in Middle East for like 4 years. It's a tough and hard topic. Maybe the well-being of people working on sex and human trafficking should be also incorporated in your presentation, because sometimes we live the trauma of these people and we are unable to do anything, and that's really reflect bad on us or any other people working on that topic. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
By the way, I'm currently working at Amnesty International, so with my current capacity. Thank you.
Thank you, Melvin. Hey, Juan.
Hi, Shannon. Hi, everyone. Hi, Team Bradford. So I'm going to follow Melvin with his comment about police corruption, because I come from Argentina, and particularly my state has a huge history of human trafficking related to sex work and construction work, and then agriculture work as well. So I personally have a lot of work experience in this field, and the police is extremely corrupt and very involved in this, especially in sex trafficking, not that much in the other systems. It's crucial to get the government involved in a healthy way, because every politician is involved in sex and human trafficking. They all have connections. It's money, relationships. They are all clients, and they all get money from whichever system of human trafficking is being implemented. So that's crucial, the interactions between the different systems. Because in the end, everyone in every small town, everybody knows where women are being kept and where they can access sex, like free sex, even if they have connections, and where these people live in horrible conditions in the middle of the countryside, chained to a tree so they can escape. Everyone knows where they live and everyone can find them, but nobody does anything because they are scared of the government and scared of the police. And then another thing that worked in my state, it had really positive results, was legalizing sex work, because it gives opportunities for some people, not everyone, because everyone's condition is different, to work by themselves, be independent, so not depending on someone to provide them protection or safety or a place where to work behind the lights, let's say. So if it's legalized, they can do it by themselves in their own place, advertise themselves in a safer way, and they don't depend in these clandestine or dangerous or very tricky, corrupt ways. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you for sharing that. Catherine, Israel, or Gonzalo, would you like to chime in? All right. Chris G, could you correct me on how much time we have left in the chat room?
We have about 5 minutes.
Fantastic.
But if I quickly make a comment on both Melvin and Juan's point. Melvin, that's amazing that you've been to South Korea and work with the people there. You probably know a lot better than I do. And yes, the police, the corruption, that's a very important factor, especially the North Korean de facto's context, because they're facing the repatriation, and obviously it is expected for them to get the severe punishment. So that's the added danger. And Juan, also, thank you for bringing up the police corruption and the government system. I think that's really important to address. But in the North Korean context, it is very difficult to dive into, because it's as Shannon mentioned, that the human trafficking and sex trafficking, it's already secrecy. It's already very tricky to investigate. But then it's the North Korean context, it's with Chinese government, it's almost, the access to the victim is almost impossible. And even if some NGOs interviewed some victims, but that's very small, isolated numbers of cases. So it's really hard to analyze the trend. But again, thanks so much, Melvin, for bringing that issue. That was very interesting.
I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, Catherine, and the sort of trafficking we have really has been increased hugely because of the situation in Venezuela. So it's girls and women from Venezuela who are seeking, well, food and a way to live, really. 21,000 have been trafficked in the last 6 years, quite often with police complicity and migration officers as well, although they come in mainly by small boats into fishing ports, and then they might spend some time in Trinidad being exploited and used, and then are trafficked further up the islands and then to the world. And most of the time they don't know what they're coming to or what they're doing, because they're being recruited with talk about work or a better life or so on. I think it's really very serious because the government hasn't recognized that people coming from Venezuela are refugees and they don't afford them human rights, and sometimes they do catch them and return them in very difficult situations as well in Venezuela. But I don't think this problem is unresolvable, because most of the women coming have not been involved in trafficking before. It's new to them, it's a trauma to them, and they certainly don't want to stay with it. They want to live, they want to eat. But they are very happy when they can get some training in micro enterprise, learn English, have computer skills, be in communication with their families. So if options were provided for them, in fact, I'm with the group that's speaking on Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago refugees in Trinidad later this evening. So there'll be a fuller picture, but we would be really glad of experience from elsewhere in helping us to approach this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I saw your camera pop on and I was thinking, oh, I'm ready to introduce you, like start to break the ice and get to know you and your experience in this. And thank you for being a speaker later as well. I'm going to jump in and
thank you.
Join this session. Lovely. Absolutely lovely. All right, guys, I think we're about to be almost done with this session. I think we just have a couple minutes left. Is there any final thoughts or ideas that we want to share? I see Juan just put his hand back up.
Yeah, thank you. So another thing that I find very important related to human trafficking is the lack of IDs or documentation that victims have. So they might have some autonomy or capacities to move around or left their places where they are being kept. But this lack of documentation or IDs doesn't allow them to access any kind of social benefit or even like business things, traveling, moving around, or even finding a new way of life. So some programs we have worked with that have shown great results were providing people IDs, giving them new IDs, because normally when people are trafficked, their owners, let's call it the way because it is what it is, they take their IDs and they basically become invisible in the system. So providing them IDs gives them small opportunities that will build up into real big changes in the long term. Thank you. Congratulations, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you back in the main room.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Welcome back, everyone. The downside of being host is that I don't get to participate when I'm sure were some very interesting discussions. So I would like to invite one of my colleagues from the conflict settings group to share some of the key points that were spoken about in that discussion.
Maria will speak to some of the key issues that were reflected in our breakout room. Welcome, Maria.
Okay, I thought that too. Okay, so we had important points of discussion. One of them was we knew about some cases around the world in different countries where children were used as slaves with different purposes, and also about the awareness of this problem. And at the end, we have very important analysis on the role of the academia. It was a question from William, who is a former Peace Fellow. from Bradford University, and we analyzed that in one of the strategies we can start applying from the academia, from the universities, is to work on public policies, increase the awareness, spread the message, and improve the literature review.
Thank you so much, Christina. Was there anything else to add from that group, Julia?
I think Alka mentioned something about the complexities of the issues when it comes to sexual violence and also human trafficking. And critical, she pointed out to how different sectors, both academia and non-academia, need to work together to address this issue, and not only being an issue that is in a specific, to be handled by a specific group. The group had a dynamic combination, which was great, and also having to hear from someone who was witnessing it from the Senegal aspect, bringing in the issue of children in non-conflict settings who were used as child laborers. So that's all to add, and William bringing in the dimension of how academia can then benefit these discussions and broaden it. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Christina. I'd now like to invite one of my colleagues from the non-conflict settings group to report on your discussions.
Yeah, no, I was really happy to just sit back and listen as a lot of the participants contributed. And I think one of the themes that arose during our discussion is that this really is everywhere. And not only is it everywhere, but this is a point that wasn't fully addressed in the presentation, which is it occurs at the elite levels in a very pernicious way. It even occurs among embassies, foreign embassies operating overseas, where they'll offer to bring individuals over and provide a life for them, and then these diplomats put them into the trafficking system. And in addition to that, it was the point was made multiple times in different settings that it's the police forces themselves who know where and how this is happening, and often participate in it and profit from the practice, and even politicians as well are involved. And I think that was, an important point for this group. The other element is some countries that are experiencing refugees who are coming in and then not afforded full rights and end up being trafficked. A couple of the solutions proposed were that when documents, personal documents that allow for identification and travel are taken away, there can be regimes for restoring individuals with these identification documents. Another proposal suggested was legalizing sex work, which takes away the demand for the underground market, for the black market, and replaces it with something that doesn't require exploitation. And so I think those were a number of the points. And I think just kind of wrapping up, one of my thoughts was just having listened to that isn't it great that as dark as it is and as difficult as this issue is, we're talking about it, we've defined it, we're understanding that this is something that's pervasive and present. And I think identifying it is very, not helpful in the immediate impact sense, but I think long-term identifying it really gives us a chance to, to address the issue more properly.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. We are in the quite unique position where we're actually running a couple of minutes under time. So I would like to now invite any one of our participants to, you can raise your hand through the function that should be at the bottom of your screen. If anyone would like to say any sort of reflections or closing comments. We do just have a few minutes, but I would like to open the floor if anyone would like to do that. Kim, would you like to share?
I just wanted to add one comment to our breakout group, which is, the realistic part of this is that it's a multi-billion-dollar, very, very lucrative industry, both labor and sex trafficking. And therefore, it's really hard to crack down on because people that make so much money, including the police, including politicians, you know, they're very skilled at this. And so it goes underground. It's very hard to identify. You've got vulnerable people who don't want to speak out. So you have all of these components that make it so hard to crack down on. And yet, fortunately, there are many organizations now working on this, but still, I think it should be mentioned, it's such a lucrative industry and growing industry, sadly.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Kim. Alka, sorry, I think you had your hand up for a second. Would you like to speak as well? That's all right. I think she might have put her hand. Oh, there she is. You're just on mute.
In our area in Iowa, we are doing training and creating a video for hotel, motel, the persons working in the hotel, motel. It's mandatory that they need to have this training happen. And that law has been passed. So many of these things, that initiatives that we are taking here is being passed. Whether in massage parlors, hotel, motel. So this is a thing that is helping, I think will help further as well in the long run.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Kim, it's such a widespread problem, and there definitely needs to be, it's unfortunate that it is so lucrative because it's difficult to put in disincentives in place. And Alka, thank you so much for that look into a project that is looking to address that issue at a really real level in a really impactful way. So thank you. Juan, I'll give you 2 minutes and then we will close the session.
Thanks, Eva. I think 2 minutes is too much, but I think we always focus on what we can do regarding law, government, police forces, like in the big picture. But I feel we also need to focus on regular people, clients, neighbors, people that actually know that this is happening, or people that actually are clients. Because if there is no demand, there is no offer. So we need to raise awareness and work with people, communities, kids in schools. And that's crucial, because if it doesn't stop from that side, people will continue to make millions and millions of money based on slavery. That's it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for your comment, Juan. And yeah, absolutely. That's actually a wonderful segue into closing out the session, because as Shannon did mention earlier, this is such a pervasive problem. It is everywhere, and it's often right in front of our noses, and we are we find it difficult to see. So I think from here, an invitation to everyone to do a little bit more self-education on the topic and the subject, and also a little more self-education on what you as an individual can do in order to help, whether it is learning to better identify people who may be in situations of human trafficking, or whether it is to support a local organization working in that area as well. So thank you so much, everyone. That brings us to the end of the session. Thank you so much for your input and your time today. Shannon has shared my email in the chat box, so in case you do want that list of resources sent through to you for further reading, I can do that for you. And yeah, I hope that, I suppose on behalf of the team, we hope you're able to find something interesting from the session. And for those of you who aren't already subject matter experts, some new knowledge about sexual violence in conflict and human trafficking. I'd like to say a massive thanks to the volunteer team running the Global Peace Conference. It's an absolutely massive undertaking, incredible initiative. And yeah, thank you for giving your time to that. Thank you to the University of Bradford for its supporting us to do this session, to our speakers today, and everyone who joined us. There are plenty more wonderful sessions upcoming in the Global Peace Conference, so do make sure that you go back to hop in and have a look at what else is available over the next 24 hours. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks to all the speakers too.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, y'all.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day in the rest of the conference. I'll see you
Nice
next
meeting you again, William.
Bye, guys.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.